Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. I am Katie Culver. I'm the James E. Burgess Chair in Journalism Ethics at UW-Madison, and I direct the Center for Journalism Ethics. We are delighted to have you here tonight for Media After the Midterms. Before I get going, I would like to offer up some thank yous. Thanks very much to our promotional partners for tonight, three organizations that really helped us get the word out: the Wisconsin State Journal, the Madison chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, and the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism, all very interested in promoting ethical practice in journalism, and so we are grateful to them. I'd also like to ask our board members, including James E. Burgess, to stand up and be recognized. Thank you so much for all that you, come on, up. They're very disobedient. Well, current and former. I'd like to thank them for all that they do to support the center and the work that we do. They are just absolutely tremendous. Also, thanks to my colleagues in the School of Journalism, one in particular, Lindsay Palmer, who is affiliated with the Center for Journalism Ethics. You can wave, Lindsay. I won't make you stand up. They really have done so much work to help get the word of the center out and to promote the work that we do. And so I'm very grateful to be surrounded by people who care so much about journalism in the public interest and how to do it with integrity. I'd also like to thank over here our three fellows, student fellows for the Center for Journalism Ethics. They do a tremendous amount of work: social media, writing, interviewing journalists, offering suggestions, eating cupcakes. They are an amazing group of people. And then finally, the person without whom tonight would not have happened, and that would be Krista Eastman, who is our brand new administrator in the center, and I am incredibly grateful for all the work that she does. She makes everything possible. So without further ado, let me also express my thanks to our three panelists and let you know who they are and what they're about. So on the far right is my colleague Devon Shaw, who is the Lewis A. and Mary E. Meyer Bascom Professor in the School of Journalism at UW-Madison. He's also director of the MassCom Research Center and the scientific director of the Center for Health and Enhancement Systems Studies. He's a very, very busy man. Devon focuses on communication influence on social judgment, civic engagement, and health support, a really fascinating field of study. And lately, he's been really interested in computational methods and applying those to the questions he has in those three areas. He uses computer-assisted text analysis, machine learning, network mapping, and predictive analytics, all in the areas of politics and health. A really fascinating arena. So thank you for joining us, Devon. And then to Devon's left is David Folkenflik, who has been NPR's media correspondent since 2004 and recently became host and editor of NPR's On Point. This Friday, he's actually going to be here in Madison doing his On Point session right there in Vilas Hall, where the journalism school is located. His stories, analyses, and commentaries appear on such shows as All Things Considered and Morning Edition, where I often hear him, and he also writes columns for NPR's website. He wrote Murdoch's World, The Last of the Old Media Empires, and is the editor of Page One, Inside the New York Times and the Future of Journalism. You'll often hear him as a commentator on a whole range of news outlets throughout the English-speaking world, and he's received numerous awards, including SPJ's 2018 Ethics in Journalism Award for some reportage that maybe we'll get to tonight. And then finally, Jessie Apoyan from the Capital Times reports on state government and politics here in Madison. As a member of the Capitol Press Corps, she covers policy, lawmakers, the governor, the new governor, interest groups and candidates, primarily at the state level, but also paying some attention to our congressional delegation at the federal level. Jessie also is an award-winning reporter. She's been recognized for work by the Wisconsin Newspaper Association and the Milwaukee Press Club. And before she came to us here in Madison, she worked for the Oshkosh Northwestern. So please, a round of applause for all our distinguished panelists. So before we get going tonight, I want to lay a little bit of groundwork, and when I was thinking about this today, because I'm a deadline-oriented person, so I was doing this at the last minute. But when I was thinking about it today, I was thinking about 2 years ago when we were in this room after the end of election 2016. We were talking about politics, ethics, and news media, and that day of the panel, a commenter on one of our social feeds had written, "The overwhelmingly biased coverage of this year's election proved one thing: journalism is dead." So, sorry, I missed the funeral. But here we are, 2 years later, and we're not dead, but we are enemies of the people. Not so much. So what I'd like to do tonight is take on some of the things that come at us from criticism, from critics of the news media. We need to till the ground where people sow some seeds of concern and discontent, and then also to sort of reveal why some of the practices that go on in journalism happen in the ways that they do. I think a really important function of this Center for Journalism Ethics is serving as a bridge between news media and the public that they are there to serve, but also a bridge between news media and research that can inform that practice. So I'm going to tee up some questions that cover a whole bunch of ground. Okay, so here we go. I'd like to start out with a question that I'd like each of you to tackle, and that is, what are your one or two biggest concerns about news media and coverage of elections today, particularly the elections? And you can address the midterms that we just came out of. I don't know how many of you were up past midnight last night. Maybe everybody's tired. But when you think about the things that you'd like to change, what are those things, and what might you do to address them? So let me lead off with you, Jesse, and maybe you can address that at the local, regional level.
Sure. Well, thank you for putting this on and having us here, and thank you all for being here. Yes, I was up till about 4 this morning, so forgive me if I get off topic here. But yeah, I think that probably two things we're looking for here. I think two of the things that come to mind, the biggest one for me has been, I think, especially coming from, before I was at the Cap Times, I was a reporter at a daily paper in Oshkosh, which is a smaller market. And in both of these communities that I've worked in, I have found myself pretty deeply entrenched in the community that I cover, and I get to know sources and I get to know readers, and I have developed, I feel, a connection, a real back and forth with people who are either consuming what I'm producing or participating in it. When I cover things that have more national impact or even a state level impact, particularly Donald Trump had a really significant presence here and continues to have a really significant presence here holding rallies in the state. There's, I think, much more of a perception of the media as a greater entity that is this big, scary, conspiratorial thing that can encompass entertainment, opinion media, all the way down to your local daily newspaper, which they're dwindling. And so I think the takeaway that I found from covering a lot of those rallies and from covering politics on a regular basis is that when I would have conversations with people who are distrustful of the media, when I would talk to them one-on-one, usually it went pretty well. Usually they might even have some gripes about the media, but they would say, well, you seem fine. You seem okay. Well, yeah, so maybe that's true about a lot of other members of the media. And I think that as newsrooms shrink and as resources are funneled away from that community-based coverage, there are fewer opportunities for people who are consuming news to be aware of the people who are producing that news and reporting on it. And so you don't know the friendly reporter who's covering your local school board meeting because there isn't one anymore. And you don't have that connection to make when you then look at what is the media covering, maybe higher stakes things, and arguably maybe not higher stakes, but things at a more national level, like the president. So I think there's an element of distrust that comes from not having a face to put toward those who are actually covering news. I think beyond that, or maybe in conjunction with that, there has been an ability for that distrust to spread, and that can trickle down into the government officials and the candidates that we cover as political reporters, and that allows them to bypass us as a source, because while they've always needed us, maybe they don't so much anymore because they have direct channels to supporters. They don't have to spend as much time trying to court people who aren't inclined to support them. And so you have people receiving news directly from a source that has an objective that maybe, I guess, less than factual or balanced, or however you want to put it. And those two things together, I think, are making it really difficult for us to do our job, and for people to trust that we're doing our job correctly, and for people to trust that they're receiving the information that they need.
David, what are some of your concerns?
I guess I have a few.
Now we're not here all night.
Right. So one of them would just be a case study, and I think it may be a little obvious, and it's obvious why it might be front of mind, but it's an interesting one. So look at the question of, for example, the way in which the president drove the issue of immigration to the forefront in this campaign, and did so by raising fears about the caravan of Central American migrants coming toward the American border at a very deliberate pace. Today you've heard nothing from that by the president, about that from the president during his press conference, as far as I can tell. Today the military dropped the name of Operation Eagle or whatever the heck it was called and said, no, we're there as a support staff. But until today, the Pentagon was calling it an operation as though it was an intense military action. And in fact, they're acknowledging their men and women will be sent down there in an exceptionally restrained support manner because there's no threat, and also there are legal concerns about what they might do down there. So the threat that these migrants posed was, from any objective sense, clearly wildly inflated and inflammatory. And the way in which it was presented in the news and just the amount of real estate that it took up on cable news and on front pages of news outlets all over the country, I think seared in people's mind the idea that this was a serious issue. And immigration is a serious issue. And the question of how we deal with people who are coming to this country seeking asylum it's open for debate. If the president wanted to open a national conversation of birthright citizenship, which he did, but did by saying he had the power to just do it with a stroke of the pen, which it appears almost certainly he does not. He kicked that too. It seemed to me as though the media has the ability to, in real time, more clearly indicate whether or not a concern being presented to the public has grounding. And it seems to me that then can evaluate for itself the degree to which it wants to devote real estate to that concern. And this feeds into perhaps a more generic concern, which is that it also feels as though oftentimes the major news outlets very much replicate what one another are doing. And I think we now have so many different ways to get news from the ground and from on high that even as a lot of newsrooms have greatly diminished, the number of places you can get things from is just enormous, that maybe they could differentiate themselves a little bit more and allow us to get a little bit more detail about promises kept or promises broken, about records versus rhetoric, about how these people have behaved in office versus what they presented themselves as candidates, so that we had a bigger feel. It's not that people haven't written about the tax cut. It's that, in election season, it takes on a different cast, and the evaluations matter, particularly comparing candidates to what they said last time to get in office and also to what they're saying now on the campaign trail. Pre-existing conditions, Republicans on the trail and advertisements saying they're the ones who are protecting that, even as a number of their folks voted repeatedly to repeal Obamacare entirely, or those provisions of Obamacare that would have subsidized taking care of pre-existing conditions. That's a pretty fundamental element of one of the most major pieces of legislation that's been in play in recent years. I think that it's totally unfair to say, a place like NPR, a place like the Washington Post, and a lot of our peers do cover a lot of really substantive issues, and it's there for the public. But I think there is so much focus on the poll or the ups and downs or whatever inflammatory issue is put in front of us in the most searing way, that it allows us to sort of not have to make actual conscious judgments about what should be the top of the news and what needs more time devoted to it. And I'm not insensible to covering these things. I think what the President of the United States says is news, even if what he says isn't true. But I have some concerns looking back on the election coverage, even as I have far fewer than I did in 2016.
I'll just add to that. I think I have some really grave concerns about our current media system. And I think it starts with the example you gave, which is, Teddy Roosevelt talked about having the bully pulpit of the presidency and how that gave them, those who occupy that position, the opportunity to push things into the public eye. But I think Trump has hacked the media system. I think he's figured out how to distract rather than direct. He's not using his powers to focus us on issues of commentary and concern. Instead, he's using it to essentially distract us at key moments. So he doesn't believe he can change birthright citizenship, but the news media will gleefully cover when he says it, and they distract us from talking about other things. I think the same thing is specifically true about the media loves to cover every time Trump attacks the media. Today we heard about him getting in a tiff with Acosta. This happens regularly. He does this on purpose, and the media gleefully covers it, and he's set himself up in opposition to the media now. So anything the media says is suspect. The media has not figured out how to respond to Donald Trump, and they're using their old rules and their old tools and techniques, and they're failing miserably in the process. He's completely outflanked them. On top of that, I think they still think they're at the center of the conversation, and they're not. It's social media now. So much is happening ancillary to what's happening with the news media, and yet there's not a recognition that there's a whole separate conversation happening that they're largely unaware of or not fully integrating into how they're reporting what's being said, what the discourse is, and how it's unfolding.
So you guys are all going to owe me some fine money because you used my least favorite term, the media. So we're going to try to be careful to distinguish between different things that people are attempting to do. When I'm out talking with people who consume news rather than people who produce news, that really is it's an issue I wrestle with all the time. And when I was at an event last week and someone said, well, the media, and I said, okay. When you talk about the media, who are you talking about? And the answer, more often than not, and last week was CNN. Let's just put a little pin in that for a minute. But I do hear when I'm talking with people, a few pretty consistent themes. So I'd like to, plumb those a little bit. One of those is the concept of bias, and certainly, David, NPR has been accused. Maybe in the last 30 seconds, has been accused of succumbing to a liberal bias. I'd like to hear how you respond to that, how you feel that kind of accusation affects your reporting, what it is that you try to do with your work, and how you overcome maybe some of your own biases. That's a lot packed into that question. You can pick and choose if you need to.
Sure. It's been a staple going back to Joe McCarthy of the sovereign state of Wisconsin for leading conservatives in the Republican Party in particular to go after the media, a thread picked up ably by Spiro Agnew and Richard Nixon. Reagan less so, but picked up. You'd started to hear it on the floor of the Republican National Committee in convention in St. Paul, 2008. Trump really ran with it and took it and elevated it to a great level. There's concern. Do we embrace this as a fight? Marty Baron, the head of the Washington Post, depicted so memorably by Liev Schreiber in Spotlight, said, "We don't go to war, we go to work." And Jim Acosta seems to, when he goes to work, goes to war. But it's more tonal than it is, he's not breaking incredibly embarrassing news for the president with really rigorous enterprise reporting. He is in the arena of performative reporting in the press room, and there are times where I appreciate it, and there are times where I think I think he's sincere about what he's doing, by the way, but he's being egged on by executives, including Jeff Zucker, who runs CNN. That plays into the Trump supporters' belief that CNN and the mainstream media more generally is biased, that CNN and its peers are biased. The president feeds this every day, so you see a polarization in terms of where trust has actually crept up among Democrats and independents in the press. It's not at an all-time low, but it's depressed even further among core Republicans, self-identified Republicans, which is ever a purer group. And that's a problem for the press. NPR gets accused of this all the time. I think some of it comes from our heritage. We emerged from community and university radio stations all over the country. In 1970, I believe the first public radio station may well have been here in Madison.
Indeed it was.
People ascribe to, NPR what it ascribes to Madison, right? As a haven in which liberals can be protected from terrible thoughts. But in reality, that's not a depiction of what the newsroom is like or what the broadcasts are like. There is probably a more accurate or fairer critique of the media to say there is a more likely to be an outlook on the world that is probably slightly more socially progressive than the nation at large, and perhaps more concerned about certain kinds of taxes than the nation at large, and reflecting the interests of the professional class as the journalism has itself become more professional. So one example of that is that newsrooms tended to be populated by people who were receptive to the idea of gay rights, and viewed that through the prism and lessons learned of covering civil rights in this country, and how the press was late to that, but when it started to cover it was a vital player in the public's understanding and acceptance of the need to treat people equally under the law as promised. And that really was a driver that forced the hand of people at Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department and with Lyndon Johnson and the rest. A lot of the press consciously knew the role they were playing at that time. Well, gay rights journalists didn't, they weren't Southern sheriffs snarling German shepherds on gay protesters, but there was, Stonewall was certainly a riot with cops on that. There's an incredible story I saw, by the way, where I can't remember if it was an obituary of this gentleman or not, but where it talked about a protester who interrupted this broadcast of the CBS Evening News to advocate for CBS to cover gays fairly. It was the 1970s, I think, early 70s. And he had to go to court and be tried, and Cronkite sat at the table next to him. He had to testify. And I think Cronkite turned to the man and said, "Why would you do that?" And he said, "Because your people your reporters were describing my friends and me as though we're not human beings. And, you guys are in this room where you don't understand there are people who live their lives this way and are just trying to live their lives and be who they are. And you're showing us no respect. How can I get your attention?" And Cronkite, to his everlasting credit, went out and assigned reporters to go and do stories about this nascent gay right movement. And it really changed how he thought about and how CBS addressed that issue slowly, but over time. Well, so reporters think about that in that way. Well, not all the nation was on board in the early 2000s as newsrooms were saying the nation is going to get to this point. And I saw it play it out in coverage in my newspaper and other places. And one of the reasons that's true is that there was this constitutional legal scholar and professor who, in the year 2008, did not accept the idea of gay equality under marriage. His name was Barack Obama. So if Barack Obama, the liberal standard bearer, in 2008 is not accepting gay rights, it's not fair to say, well, the nation accepts this. It's just everyone who doesn't is bigoted. It's saying the nation isn't there yet, and maybe that's wrong in retrospect. It certainly seemed to a lot of us that it was, but newsrooms have to be conscious of that kind of thing. That's very different from saying you're motivated. You want to get out of bed. I don't want to get out of bed to carry a brief for anyone. If I wanted to do that, I would have gotten into politics. It seems to me that people are fair to say, hey, check your assumptions and test them and listen to people. One of the great things about public radio is we listen to people. You have to listen. We present people in their own voices. They get to be heard. We give them time to unpack their thoughts. They get to be understood. We try to do it with a sense of respect and civility, not to smooth out the edges so that there's no roughness in society, but they can be heard. I think these are vital qualities, never more important than in the current day. And we try to both model those and reflect those. But NPR is actually in some ways one of the most down-the-middle news organizations in some ways you can imagine. The care and pain that we take to do this is extraordinary. Our ombudsman, who's our sort of paid critic, looked at us, and I think over the 400 and some guests that she tallied in a 6-month period who had partisan affiliations, it came down to within one of being exactly 50-50. It was like 222 Republicans and 221 Democrats or something. And we don't have ideological commentators who every week tell you what to think except when they're paired, and things like David Brooks and E.J. Dionne or Rich Lowry and someone else. It's by and large a very scrupulously balanced in terms of its commentators, and then extremely pared down as best we can in terms of the ideology. It's a fallible, it's a mortal news organization. There are times where I wish some of its reporting was a little harder edged. And not simply against one side, but just in terms of the way in which we framed it and the way in which we reported it. But to associate us with liberal bias is to not understand the NPR of today or of the past 15 years.
Jesse, you spoke earlier about, dealing with these accusations of bias, and I thought it was really interesting that you said, sort of as it ramps up out of local and into statewide and then beyond into national, that gets worse. Are there things that you do to try to combat those perceptions of bias, or are you just, I'm doing my work with, as objective a set of methods. We can't be objective humans, but we can use objective methods. I'm just doing my work and I'm putting it out there.
Well, I think I would probably gravitate more toward the latter, but I would say, I every now and then speak to classes ranging from fourth graders to college journalism students, and without fail, within the first 3 questions, someone asks, well, how do you keep your bias out of what you do? And I think that's a totally reasonable question for people to ask. I think the longer you do your job as a journalist, if you really like it and you really ascribe to what it's all about, you don't even really think about it all that much. But, similarly to NPR and even more so, I work for the Cap Times, which is a paper that labels itself your progressive voice. So naturally, that being what it is and also located in Madison, there are a lot of assumptions that come along with that. And over the last almost decade in Wisconsin, covering the legislature and state government here, it's been under Republican control. So you can imagine, there are some bridges that have to be built, or relationships that have to be formed based on an assumption of maybe not quite distrust, but just sort of skepticism of, well, are you really going to treat me fairly? And I understand that. I think a lot of what has to be done is no different from any other journalistic coverage, which is just building relationships. And good beat reporting is about building relationships. And I think avoiding aspersions of bias is also about building relationships. And that's not about looking for favors or trying to bend too much in one direction or the other. I don't really ascribe to the philosophy that if you're making everyone angry or you're making everyone happy that you're doing things right. I don't necessarily think that that's a good way to go about things, but it is always interesting when, I work at a paper that is really thought to be your progressive voice in liberal Madison, Wisconsin. Of course, everyone's going to think that I'm going to cover things from a leftist perspective, but I also get probably more criticism than not these days of people thinking that I'm too friendly to conservatives and too friendly to Republicans. So you can't really win. And I think that's more about the way, what people are looking for in their news coverage and their media consumption at this point than about how journalists are doing their jobs. But I guess all of that is to say, I don't think about it every day. I don't go in and think, well, how am I going to be unbiased today? And how am I going to treat everyone fairly? And that's just what I do. But I think what David said about some of the best things about NPR are some of the things that we all hope for in the way that we do our jobs, and that is to listen to people and to give them a chance to be heard. And that's my favorite part about my job, is that I get to go to the state capitol or go to a campaign rally or go to towns throughout Wisconsin and talk to people and find out, why are you introducing this piece of legislation? Why did you vote for this person? Why are you at this campaign rally? And regardless of what I think, and regardless of what the majority of people I surround myself think, regardless of what the last person that I interviewed for that story thinks, I find value in what those people tell me. And I incorporate that into the coverage that I produce. And if I feel, I may have learned something, I may have had my mind changed, I may have changed someone else's mind, who knows? I think the value of what we do is that we get to listen to people, not just hear them, but really listen to them, and then take that, amplify it, make it translatable, make it understandable to other people, and give them the chance to think about it too. And maybe they weigh in next time, and hopefully you continue to facilitate that dialogue. And to me, that's sort of how we combat everyone's bias, and certainly how we get past our own, because it's not really about us. No one hired us to be newspaper or radio or TV reporters to give our own opinions. I mean, I'm not qualified to tell you what I think for any good reason, but the people that I'm talking to deserve to be heard, and that's my job, is to amplify their voices and help make them understandable and help facilitate further conversations.
So, Devon, I've kind of become famous for saying journalism ethics isn't just for journalists anymore. And whenever I have these conversations about bias, I think one of the things that's most misunderstood is the bias is in how much bias is in the eye of the beholder. So, what does social science tell us about perceptions of bias among consumers of news, since we've already explored the producers?
Sure. There's pretty clear evidence that we see bias in a way that suggests if you hold a strong partisan viewpoint, you see bias in the media in the opposite direction. So if you're a liberal, you see conservative bias. If you're a conservative, you see liberal bias. Now, there's amplifying factors in that. One of them is the rhetoric that tends to dominate one side versus the other, and I think we were already hearing about that. I think Republicans, and you brought up Spiro Agnew, nattering nabobs of negativity. We've heard the various phrases being used to characterize, the press, especially as having a liberal bias coming mainly from the right. And I think we have a rhetorical environment that amplifies that. And I think one of the things that happened with Trump in particular is he's been able to say that, and the reporters cover it, and it only amplifies that. And we've done research in the 92, 96, and 2000 elections showing that claims of liberal bias have been increasing among conservative politicians, that those claims actually have an impact on public opinion, leading over the course of elections to have the public view the media as having a more liberal bias, even as a particular election unfolds. And so I think that's a big factor in this too. I think the third factor is our social networks and our tendency to talk to people who are like-minded. And so one of the things we also know is perceptions of liberal bias or conservative bias are amplified by when we're in homogeneous networks. So if we tend to talk to people who are like us, we tend to see more bias. Now, now we go back to the media system and say, well, is there actual bias in the system? I think one of the points that you just made is we are seeing in the U.S. media system more, I wouldn't say fragmentation, but a wider range of partisan voices, right? We are seeing certainly conservative spaces like Daily Caller or Breitbart. We're seeing broadcast networks like Fox. We're also seeing, I think most people would say that, while legacy media are very sound in their journalistic approaches, they are also probably progressive in their political orientation, if not that notion of being truly neutral. I think a lot of issues that core media focus on tend to have a progressive orientation. And then we have a true leftist system as well in terms of, you go to HuffPost or Daily Kos or other spaces. So we're seeing more of a fragmentation. So now it's not just that they're actually, is there actual bias? No, I think we have more of a range of media voices, and people see bias in the voices that they don't tend to consume.
If I could just weigh in, I think one of the interesting features, I covered politics in the late 90s for the Baltimore Sun before I became a media reporter. And you started to see with the Clinton impeachment, liberals being unhappy with the media, and Whitewater, there's a lot of resentment there. You started seeing with the recount, everybody was unhappy with the media, particularly liberals, because their side didn't win, and therefore they blamed the media for not blowing the whistle on what they felt was an unfair verdict of what was clearly a jump ball, effectively. The failure of the weapons of mass destruction. You saw liberals really upset with the media. And suddenly you saw, I wouldn't say liberal distrust of the media matched conservative distrust of the media, but you saw growing unhappiness with the media from the left, of feeling that they weren't capable of performing adequately for what they saw were the public good, but also for what their side was interested in. And I think that you saw, I think that people who populate newsrooms may ultimately at the home be more likely to think of themselves as progressive or than others. But I would say that on military issues and on certain kinds of economic issues, there's sort of a divide where you see a social liberalism, you see kind of an economic, it's sleight of hand maybe, or shorthand too much, but maybe you call slightly right or center on this. And there's enough for, I'm not saying it's equal, and I totally agree. If you're pissing off both sides, you may be doing something really right or something really wrong. But there are ways in which there are things that dissatisfy a whole panoply of audiences that makes for a tough media segmentation. Weirdly, the moment of seemingly self-inflicted sense of crisis that we now have at the national level has driven up an affinity for journalism and journalists among the center and the left. to a surprising and asymmetrical degree. One of the things I point out is we just live in a very asymmetrical age. And the media is part of that, but it's also caught up in that, I would say.
I agree. I think the issue with liberals' distrust of the media, it tends to be episodic and it tends to be in spasms, and it returns to more of a sense of equilibrium. With conservatives, we've seen a very slow, gradual, steady rise, really fostered by rhetoric on the right to sow distrust in the media. And it's part of a very conscious project. This is not something that's just happening. It's something that conservatives are doing and journalists are participating in by covering conservatives saying this. It's meta coverage. They're covering themselves and they're shooting themselves in the foot in the process. And it's one of the things that I would hope journalists post this election cycle would start to become more aware of, that they are actually being played in this process.
So I'm going to try not to natter, and I don't think I'm a nabob, but I am going to get back to that negativity because one of my abiding concerns, see how I did that? One of my abiding concerns about news coverage is the idea of conflict. So when you talk to people and they say, oh, they just cover too much bad news, where's the good news? When you pull that apart, you're really getting at the idea that conflict sells. And, you know, honestly, Donald Trump is a savant when it comes to the how to get to the top of the top of the morning news hour, to get on above the fold on the print paper. He really knows how to play to the kinds of practices of journalism, right? It's really a unique sense, at least in my lifetime. One of those things is certainly conflict. And so I'd like you to sort of dig into that a little bit. And maybe, Devon, I could start with you. You know, you've talked a lot about rhetoric. Are we seeing increasing levels of conflict coming from, you know, news sources like the president, like, you know, partisans on the left and the right? And what do you think, if anything, journalism has done to respond to that, or what should they do differently?
I mean, I think we're clearly in a very contentious and polarized political era. I think that's not surprising to anyone in this room, or I think most of the audience and most of the panelists would agree that that's the case. The question of what media is doing that is kind of contributing to that, I think, well, we're seeing a more fragmented and polarized media environment that mirrors our partisanship, right? But I also think elites are more polarized. So this is happening at different levels, and it's reinforcing itself in this process. Now, what's the kind of answer to this, or how do we deal with conflict? I think, you know, it's obviously a core journalistic norm. What's interesting is when you don't have, you know, the big change from last night is now Democrats have the House, they have chairmanships of committees, chairwomanships of committees, they can put things on the agenda, and if journalism works the way it's supposed to, it's called indexing. You're supposed to be paying attention to the range of voices that have political power. It was easy to ignore Democrats when they didn't really have a lot of power. Hopefully now there's more of an effort at balance, and Trump can't occupy as much space, or simple conflict with him won't be the defining characteristic of the news. I would love to see more, you know, deeper, both investigative and deeper thematic reporting on issues of concern. But I think, you know, this goes back to what you were saying about Jim Acosta. A lot of journalism becomes performative. A lot of it's now about cable news hosts. And, you know, when Sean Hannity appears on stage with Donald Trump, we've entered a new era in terms of.
But he says he didn't.
Well, of course, and it wasn't planned, but just announced 4 days in advance. You know, I mean, this is the lines we're crossing and the blurring that we're seeing that I think is so deeply troubling about contemporary reporting, and even the notion of what conflict means in that environment. Right? I mean, yes, we know Fox News is a partisan source, but to have a host appear on stage with Trump is a new level. Right? It's a new kind of tightness or affinity between news institutions, quote unquote, and politicians. I think if you saw, you know, someone from the New York Times or MSNBC appear on stage with a Democratic candidate, you wouldn't hear the end of it. And I think that asymmetry is important to explore too. What conflict means, who gets to define conflict, when do we decide something deserves our attention, do we clutch our pearls, and on what conditions do we say, you know, it's just fine, we expect Sean Hannity to do that. That's amazing to me, that there's a whole different set of rules for the right than there is for the left.
Jesse, do you buy that there's a different set of rules for the right versus the left?
Oh, man. I don't know, but I do think I think that I hear criticism of this certainly frequently, especially covering politics in Wisconsin over the last 6 to 8 years. Republicans have had power, like you mentioned. Those who are in power are more likely to gain your attention. If legislative Republicans hold a press conference about legislation they're going to introduce, journalists are going to cover that because that legislation is going to pass. If Democrats hold a press conference about legislation they're going to introduce, journalists might cover that, but they're probably not going to pay a lot of attention to it because that legislation is not going to pass. So sure, I mean, there's an element of that there, and that's problematic because the more voice you give to those who are in power, probably the more likely they are to hold on to that power. But I guess another element, and David talked about this, is what are the inherent biases that exist in newsrooms? And I don't know that they exist across the board, but sure, if journalists are constantly being accused of being too liberal and being too beholden to progressive causes or coverage, then maybe they will subconsciously, maybe not intentionally start to try to give more due to conservatives. Maybe they will be a little more forgiving when Sean Hannity appears on stage with Donald Trump, because that is expected. I don't know. I'm not making decisions at the national level in a way and that happens, and things like Sean Hannity appearing on stage with Donald Trump don't really necessarily happen covering Wisconsin politics. So I think that's something we hear about, absolutely. Every day that I do my job, I hear from a Democrat who says, if a Democrat did this, you guys would cover it X way, but you're letting this Republican get away with that. As we see power shift, maybe we'll see that flip. I don't know. It's been a certain way for a pretty long time here in Wisconsin, so I'm not sure how much I can speak to that. But yeah, it's absolutely something I hear about.
Can I follow up with a quick question?
Yeah, please.
So, you have a lot of guests on NPR, and I don't imagine you would say you have a cozy or friendly relationship with any of them. But it seems like on, say, Wisconsin political talk radio, there are Republicans who are quite cozy with many of the guests. There isn't, so when we talk about
Republicans who are cozy with guests or the hosts?
The hosts, I'm sorry. And so this idea that, there is a tighter kinship between power elite and media players on the right than there is on the left. And yet there's this false parallelism. Oh, there's talk radio on the left and there's talk radio on the right. No, there's not. There's NPR on the quote-unquote progressive left, but on the right there's a very tight alignment between political authority and the broadcasting, using the public airwaves to share views. It's a very different world.
It is, I don't speak for NPR. I get to critique NPR in my job. Sometimes they like it, sometimes they don't. But I would also, as I assume they would, take issue with the idea of actually locating us in the progressive left. That may be perceived, but that's not what animates us, and that's not where we always are in terms of analyses of what we do coverage-wise. But I understand why people arrive at that, and it is what it is. I would be surprised if people on, there's a performative thing. Like you see these cable shows and these people are going hammer and tongs at each other. And half the time, like the camera turns off, the light goes off.
And they're buddies. They're
all friendly. They're all getting paid by CNN or MSNBC. It's all good, Particularly MSNBC these days, because almost all the Republicans are well, no, but they're not having to wrestle on MSNBC because all the Republicans there are anti-Trump as well. Right. Now, CNN, the problem is they do get in fights sometimes because they get in trouble. They have Democrats, they get anti-Trump Republicans, and then they get pro-Trump Republicans or just pro-Trump. And some of these people are saying things they know not to be true or incendiary or intentionally trolling their other guests, and then these guys get into tough fights, and that's not so friendly. And that's problematic. And you don't see that on MSNBC so much because they tend not to go for the pro-Trump voices. There is most folks appearing on NPR shows, most of them I've never met in person, and some of them I've spoken to by phone or whatever, in terms of the people you interview on Point or People I interview for my stories, I might know more because I've covered the beat for a very long time. But there's not, I don't socialize with these people by and large. Every now and then I'll know somebody, but that's not how I do my job. In Washington, they might socialize. And there is definitely some truth to the idea that elites in media and elites in politics know and recognize each other, and there are some social involvements, and sometimes those things get complicated. And that the powerful figures recognize the influential figures in the media, and therefore there's kind of a rapport that might transcend whatever obligation each feels it owes the public in various ways. And that's kind of problematic too. In Britain, it became totally incestuous, and it all collapsed in the tabloid scandal that I've covered some years ago, because it was clear that a lot of the journalists were corrupt, a lot of the law enforcement was corrupt, a lot of the politicians were corrupt. It was just ugly, and people were getting hurt in the process. It's just not good. This is not that way, but there is a staging of political discourse and debate that almost encourages it to become amplified, divisive, conflict-driven, and ultimately not useful. And there are some guests who CNN invites on, and only recently have they forced them to acknowledge that they've signed non-disclosure agreements that prevent, and non-disparagement agreements that prevent them from saying anything critical of the people that they used to work for, which is to say the administration. That is in no way a recognition of the role. Supposedly they're there to serve the audience. Like particularly if they have CNN commentator tag. Their first obligation when taking money from CNN should be to serve CNN by serving the public and offering insight, sometimes against interest. My major concern is I don't have a problem with an avowedly progressive outlet. You think of Mother Jones, they do really good journalism. There are other places that do some really good journalism. Washington Free Beacon has some very good stories in it. I want them to admit facts against interest. I want them to acknowledge them. I want them to be honest brokers of information even as they're making a case or marshaling facts in a certain direction. And if you don't do that, if you're simply staging fights, that is not helpful. It is, and it serves to both juice up the audience members to stick around, but also ensure their cynicism about what it is you're up to.
And then that cynicism saps their sense of efficacy as citizens. So they don't matter as much. So before I open it up for audience questions, so homework assignment, everybody get ready with your questions. I have one final question, and it circles way back to something that Devon said at the beginning about Donald Trump and sort of hacking the news media. I mean, clearly, again, in my very short lifetime, he's unique in how he has been able to sort of smash these kind of long-held norms of politics and of political journalism. It's nothing I would have predicted, and it's like nothing I've ever seen. Do you think, each of you, and like each of you to answer this, do you think news organizations are doing enough? I mean, Devon has already used flat-footed, so I think we know where he's coming from. But do you think news organizations are doing enough to respond to this? And if not, what should they be doing differently?
I'll just start by setting the stage in one regard, which is Donald Trump got $4.5 billion in earned, which means free media coverage, over the course of the 2016 election.
Primary and general? Primary and general.
Okay, so take a moment to explain what that means.
That means
and
all
say that
of
it's the equivalent of that.
So it's all the space and time he got. If you were to convert that into television ratings and have to purchase it from an advertising standpoint, it'd be worth $4.5 billion. Hillary Clinton got $3.3 billion. So he had even in the primary period when he was up against Cruz had less. He had something like 2.2 in the primary period. Cruz had less than 900 million in coverage. I mean, it is insane the difference in terms of how he's gotten that coverage and how much more the news media pays attention to him than anybody else. Now, as a president, obviously he has the bully pulpit. I'm just talking about as a candidate when things should arguably be equivalent. Not at all. You take into account his public opinion poll standing. You take into account his delegate count. None of that explains it. You know what explains him getting all this media attention? It's retweets of his messages. That's the single biggest predictor and most consistent predictor of when Donald Trump gets coverage. Is if he tweets and it gets heavily retweeted, it becomes news. And he's figured that out. He's figured out how to use the social media engine to drive the news. And here's the even more interesting fact, which is that process, the only thing that explains when Donald Trump tweets is when he's not getting news coverage. That's the biggest predictor of when he'll do a tweet storm. So this guy has figured something out, and journalists have not figured out how to respond to him.
Well, how should they do it differently then?
They shouldn't cover him, not nearly as much as they do. They should cover him. I mean, they should cover a range of political actors. They should be indexing a range of political operators. They should, sure, Democrats don't have power in the Wisconsin election. It doesn't mean their positions don't have value to cover. Doesn't mean you shouldn't say, hey, here's what the liberal position on this is. They're not in office. They're not probably going to get this passed, but here's the other side of this issue. That's not happening, right? That's our failure.
You got to lean into the microphone, radio man.
That involves the assumption I want to answer the question.
Come on, Natter.
Not on NPR. There's no one really listening. Just a friendly audience.
And my streaming friends over there. So
well, that too.
You know, I think you just have to ask a rhetorical question. Do you want to live in a society where there's a conscious decision not to cover the president? I think that, for example, there was a very interesting moment not so many days ago. The president holds an announcement that he says he's going to announce something. I think it was last Friday on immigration. And it might have been Thursday. I think it was Friday. And CNN and Fox News go live. MSNBC decides not to. There is no new policy he's announcing. He's just rehashing things he's already talked about previously. So the President of the United States is commanding live attention on two of the three largest news networks because he says he'll have something new. He has nothing. MSNBC says ahead of time, we're going to see if he has anything that's newsworthy, and we're going to fact check what he has. I think they look pretty good. CNN covers it live for a bit, dumps out. Jake Tapper says there's nothing new there. They dump out in the middle of it, so they don't go on ad nauseum, but they give him for a while to just give him a chance to say something. And then they say, we're going to fact check a bunch of the things you just heard on this network. I can't fact check everything, Jake said. He's like, because that would take all night. But he does do a pretty yeoman's job of trying to walk through all the things that were said that were untrue. I don't love that, but given the current vernacular of the way cable news goes, reasonable enough. Fox News just covers the damn thing. And, you know, they offer some clarifying points around the edges, and they go through that, and then they go to, you know, I don't know, Hillary Clinton's email servers or Benghazi or something. So fine. So, you know, those are three different approaches. I think MSNBC, although often ideological, one made a journalistic choice, possibly driven by the ideological sympathies of its audience, but nonetheless perfectly justifiable. We didn't used to cover everything live. You know, Trump has gotten us conditioned to the idea that everything is in crisis mode. We are not actually in crisis. We have very low unemployment. We are not at a major level of war at the moment. The migrants haven't gotten here yet to apply for asylum in the way that you might apply for library cards, but fine. Like, you know, it's not a threat. And yet there has been coverage of the migrants as though somehow it's an invading horde, and there's been language there that adopts the administration's rhetoric, and I think that is, forgive me for anticipating, a failure of imagination to assign for ourselves what rhetoric we should be using as opposed to merely mirroring what people in authority says. The funny thing is you have a figure who, as a candidate, had basically 100+% name recognition and who led in the polls, and I looked this very carefully, but led in the polls from the moment he announced to the moment he accepted the nomination in Cleveland in 2016, with the exception of about 2.5-day period where Ben Carson just kissed the lead. And it was right around Thanksgiving weekend, so maybe everybody was a little, you know, tryptophan that affected their judgment. So, you know, Trump needed to be taken seriously and literally in that primary season. Republican voters need to be treated to a full understanding of the figure who was leading in the polls significantly throughout. And he was treated as an entertainment figure. And then when things got serious and he was clearly going to be the nominee, they treated him more seriously as a candidate, and he won. And then as president, they just lurched along with sort of self-created crisis to crisis. And we've covered it as though it's all at fever pitch. Part of the reason we've done that is some of the things he has implemented have created many crises in government. They've created crises of just effectiveness. They've been incredibly disruptive. They haven't been very well plotted out, regardless of how disruptive the actual policies are. And these have created ruptures in sort of governmental agencies and in the people who interact with our own government. And this has been a problem, and you've seen it again and again. So that has created little crises that we cover at a fever pitch. But I don't think we cannot cover him. I don't think we can even not cover what his tweets say, because I think that both citizens look at what he says, federal employees, I promise you, look at what he says to figure out what to make of his policy pronouncements, because they don't always get it, and they're trying to figure out what direction what they're supposed to do with these things. And foreign governments look to these things. Part of the reason why I can't say, you know what, we should just not look at his rhetoric on the press is foreign governments look to how he talks about the press to figure out how much they can get away with mistreating the press and suppressing dissent and speech in their countries. And you've seen that in Turkey. You know, the leader of Turkey is not going after the Saudis over Khashoggi because they are avatars of First Amendment freedoms. They are among the worst on the Committee for Protection of Journalists lists every year. What they're doing is an incredibly strong geopolitical play. But, you know, when the president talks about CNN as the enemy of the people, even days after they've received pipe bombs addressed to their newsroom, it gives cover to the Chinese to just, you know, throw dissenting journalists in jail. You know, there was, I think, a tweet from the, was it the Kenyan Army forces, which had basically in Nigeria, forgive me for getting that wrong, but you know that had basically suppressed civil liberties and suppressed the press in a pretty brutal fashion, and pointed to the president's rhetoric online in the social media in doing so. These things have repercussions, and I think that without being self-important, like, we can't let that go by the wayside. So there are these balancing acts that we haven't gotten right, but I don't think that we should abdicate a role in sort of exploring and highlighting.
Well, Khashoggi is a great example. Journalists love covering other journalists and covering themselves. Saudi Arabia has been a horrible human rights violator for years. They've treated women terribly. They've done so many terrible things. We don't cover that. We cover it when a journalist is affected, right? I mean, again, journalists love covering themselves. So
I got to say, I think this one is because you have a distilled nature of a sympathetic person. If he had been a grad student, he had gone in, he had written for an identifiable you know, if he had been a student at a major American university that had name brand recognition, he went into a consulate to get a wedding license.
No, I'm not.
But I'm just saying
I'm not debating what he went in to do or whether he's a sympathetic figure. The point is, that was an opportunity for journalists to actually talk about what's happening in Saudi Arabia. Instead, they focused on a single figure. They didn't do the larger reporting.
I think you've seen a lot more reporting on Yemen as a result. I think it's to the press's discredit that it didn't look at that more previously, but I think you've seen a lot more attention given since.
And again, I think
I'm gonna send you guys off to a corner for a second. I want to bring it down to the local level and just ask Jesse, do you see this kind of norm busting happening when you're talking with state legislators, gubernatorial candidates? Is what we're seeing at the national level trickling down and having an effect at the local level, or are things pretty much the way you saw them 6 years ago?
I think by and large, we have been shielded from a lot of that. First of all, I'd like to just co-sign on most of what David said, because that was how I was going to answer this. Just all of that. It was all the same. No, I think, you know, part of the Trump element is that there is some local and state coverage required of Trump because he comes to states like Wisconsin, and he comes to Wisconsin particularly frequently. And so we did have some debates. He was here, I have lost track of all time, but a week ago, 2 weeks ago, a year ago, I don't know. He was in Mosinee campaigning for Scott Walker and for Leah Vukmir and for all the Republicans who were on the ballot yesterday. And this was the day that the pipe bombs were sent to prominent Democratic figures, were sent to CNN, and everyone was waiting to hear what Donald Trump said about it in Wisconsin. And there were a couple elements of coverage. So for me coming into this, I am looking to see what is Donald Trump saying about our elections and what are people there saying about our elections. I'm not covering this the way that the National Press Corps is covering this, and I'm not fact-checking necessarily the national claims that are being made. I'm fact-checking the things about Donald Trump said Foxconn's going to bring 15,000 jobs, but in fact it's going to be more like 3,000 to 13,000 if things go well. You know, I'm here to do that. But I'm also here to say, what does he say about these pipe bombs. And there was debate, I think, among press far and wide over if he tries to ignite some sort of backlash against the press and tries to blame the press for this, should we ignore it? And I think, no, I think absolutely we shouldn't ignore it. Do I agree to a certain point? Journalists enjoy covering journalists? Yeah, probably. And we are probably a little bit performative about it. But I do think that there's a reason for that, and that's because journalism is incredibly important. To go back to your question about the state and local level, I think we've been shielded from that, like I said, to a pretty significant degree. I think most of the reporters who have been covering state politicians here in Wisconsin have been here for a while. Those of us who have been here for less time, I've been here about 5 years, or people who have been here even shorter time than that, but we get folded into that and are given sort of the benefit of the respect that is granted toward us for the most part. Do I see some elements starting to creep in? Yeah, I think during this last campaign period, we saw Scott Walker take to Twitter more than he ever had. He was not a person who utilized Twitter for much more than photos of ham sandwiches and Star Wars blankets.
And Kohl's Cash.
Kohl's Cash, sure. You know, it was a very folksy, like Twitter was a folksy thing for him. Scott Walker started making statements and proclamations in campaign propositions and even going after other candidates more on Twitter during this campaign cycle than ever before. And I'm sure that that is a reflection on what he saw work for Donald Trump. And it did work. We did cover that. Do I think we shouldn't have? Yeah, maybe sometimes. Maybe there are times when we took the bait, but by and large, I think you can't ignore what a head of state at any level is saying, regardless of where that's happening. But I do think the advantage that we have or have had here is that we might run into him in the Capitol if we're working there. We might have a chance to ask him about it. We might be able to dig into it deeper in a way that that access isn't necessarily available at the national level to the same degree.
And I wanted to say one thing. In the time we've been talking, my watch has buzzed about 7 to 10 times. So why did it buzz? It buzzed because Jim Acosta just had his press pass to the White House revoked for his exchange with the president earlier today. Is today? Today. And
or last week or a month ago.
It seems like forever ago. And the press house secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, said he did that. They revoked it because Jim Acosta, I guess, put his hands on, as they describe it, the intern who was trying to wrest the microphone away from him. He did make contact with her. He didn't, to my mind, wrest it away from her or push her, but that is certainly the way they're portraying it. Now, there is a spirited and lively debate happening on my iPhone right now, whether I should hop over and go on to All Things Considered and talk about this, whether we should ignore it, whether we should cover it in a spot, which is like a 1-minute piece on the top of the bulletin. I have a thought about what I would going to advise after this all wraps up, but I'd be interested.
Hopefully informed by this conversation.
You joke. I was going to say, briefly, I would be interested in each of your thought about how we should approach that.
I think you have. We haven't even talked about what I would qualify as a Democratic blue wave. If you talk about a 7% net shift in favor of House seats, when you talk about what happened, how many Senate seats need to be defended and how many they won, how many governorships changed hands, how many state assemblies are now veto-proof. There's a huge story there. There's a huge story with Sessions, and yet we're talking about Trump's fight with the media. That's all. I'll just stop there.
So I believe Devon's answer is no.
What's the vote? Is the vote don't cover it at all? It's cover it as a story or cover it as a brief?
I think my general answer to this is Trump's getting, and I think the evidence would bear this out very clearly, compare his coverage to Obama, compare it to Clinton, compare it to Reagan, to Bush. He's getting way more coverage for anything he does than any of those other presidents did. He's able to dominate and essentially push other things out of the news cycle, including the fact that there was just a massive Democratic win last night, and he's done 2 things already to push that out of the news cycle. It's amazing. You said a savant. He's brilliant at this, folks. This is not a mistake, and journalists aren't catching on.
Let me just say, he's absolutely right. By the way,
coming to you, people.
The stuff with the Attorney General is a change of topic, an instantaneous one.
Brilliant.
The stuff with the press as well. But you notice the wonderful insights we have here didn't make an editorial decision, which I have to make.
That's right.
I'll make that.
Actually, in the news business.
I just
So tell me.
advise.
I would cover it as a brief. I think you can't ignore it. This is a major news outlet. This is a person who is a member of the White House press corps who, for whether it was justifiable or not, and I think we can look at the video footage to see whether he did what he was accused of doing. It sounds like he didn't. You have to talk about it. You have to mention it. Do we need to spend 5 minutes on it? No, probably not.
Yeah, I totally agree. Anyhow, I'll yield with that. But I'll tell you, those are the kind of real life, real moment choices.
Notice that the director of the Center for Journalism Ethics did not get to weigh in on that. Boy, oh boy.
Well, what
All
would
right.
you do?
We're gonna. What would I say? I would say I want to see your rundown. I want to see the minutes, and I want to see the proportionality between the Acosta thing, which should be this big, and the Sessions thing, which should be this big. That the time that you dedicate to that should be a small fraction.
I really don't think you have any fear on that score.
Okay, well, I'll be listening tomorrow, morning edition. I'm gonna. I might actually time it. No, I'm very satisfied with NPR coverage as a consumer of it. I yell at it sometimes, but okay. So who has a question? We're going to wait for our fine gentleman here, Isaac, to come to you. And if you could just wait for the mic right here in front. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you
Hi.
for coming.
Thank you.
One thing Jesse started off with about working in small communities and one-on-one interactions, and then how that it got me thinking about empathy, and how it got me wondering whether one of the things that audiences are perhaps craving and not getting from neutral, quote, media is a sense of empathy and a sense that I'm on your side, and that the reaction that I as an audience member am having to hearing this story is the same reaction that you're having telling me about it. If, a better headline would be, this terrible thing happened today, let me tell you about it, instead of 3 kids died in a car crash or something like that. Straight news maybe presents people with a wall that prevents the audience from connecting, and that lack of empathy is perhaps one of the reasons that the news media gets accused of bias.
I think there's an interesting point or contrast to be made between empathy and emotion, because I'm sure probably I'm not the only person here who listens to the daily podcast from the New York Times, but there was an episode recently about the proliferation of really hard-edged partisan news sources on Facebook. And so the podcast profiled a couple who runs a site.
Mad World News.
That's it, Mad World News. And they found over the years that the more they ginned up emotion and said this terrible thing happened, basically, in a headline, and it was really incendiary things like, Hillary Clinton spits at the military or whatever, stuff like that. They did get more people to read it and click on it, but was that necessarily for the best? Probably not. That's not empathy, that's emotion, and that's pretty raw, cheaply found emotion. Empathy, yeah, maybe. I think empathy or honesty, maybe the two go hand in hand a little bit. And so I think people are perhaps tired of things being couched in both sidism is what we hear, right? Yeah, the view from nowhere. Yeah, I think people do get tired of that and frustrated by that when it is clear that something is true and it's not being said that that's true, or it is clear that something's terrible and it's not being said that it's terrible, or it is clear that something's racist and it's not being said that it's racist. And those are debates that are had constantly. Which you, Nick, worked in a newsroom, so you're aware of that, but. I don't know. I guess I don't know what the answer is, and I don't know if it's a good thing to necessarily say in a headline, "Isn't it awful that these 3 children were killed?" Well, yeah, of course it is. But is that our job to tell you how to feel about it? I hope you feel awful about it, but I'm just here to tell you what happened. I think the connection maybe is more of what's missing in it, that whether it's a local connection or just a thought that, you are invested in telling this story for real reasons because you have a connection to the community that you're covering. I think that's something that's missing.
I think that's one of the real challenges of journalism ethics, actually, is that the concept of independence has embedded in it this idea of remoteness, of not being invested in your community, that if you are too invested, then you lose the alleged objectivity. We'll debate about that for years to come. But this idea that you have to remain separate or other can cause real problems when it comes to empathy. It's a real struggle, I think, for a lot of people in newsrooms. And you know, it's an ethics challenge. And I think you're right that it does play into that idea, the sort of level of trust. Because if I don't feel that you have this human connection with me, why would I trust you? I mean, trust is one of the most sort of intimate concepts there is. And if I don't feel that we have that human connection, why would I trust you? All right, do we have another question right here? We just pass the mic down that row, that'd be great.
Hey. So some media scholars have suggested that bias in the media doesn't come from a partisan side, but it comes from like a dramatization or like a horse race kind of framing in the news. Do you think that the results from yesterday's election putting a substantial amount of Democrats in Congress against Republicans in Congress will increase the amount of dramatization in news? And do you think this will affect consumers adversely?
So I think what you're talking about is there's a pretty sizable research body of research that suggests that when we cover issues in terms of policy or in terms of what's happening legislatively, that has generally more positive effects on our sense of engagement with politics. On the other hand, when we cover the game of politics or the horse race or the strategy, that tends to produce cynicism. We tend to view political actors as just trying to get ahead. It's all gamesmanship to see who can win or lose. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that kind of reporting now that we have Democrats controlling chairmanships of committees and launching investigations and doing all these other things. So I think we'll see more of that brinksmanship. I think that's going to be a feature of what 2018, 19, 20 reporting is going to be all about. Now, it's already been about that, so whether it's a huge uptick or not, I'm not sure, but I think that certainly seems like it'll be a function of what just happened.
I think I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that. I want to make sure I understood your term. You say dramatization? Yes. So to me, you're going to see two things. You know, consistently you've seen Republicans outnumber Democrats on like the Sunday morning public affairs show. And it'll be very interesting to see if that changes or not. But you saw Democrats wildly outweigh them, whereas when, you know, Democrats had control of the Congress, or at least control of the White House and an element of the Congress, it wasn't as lopsided. So that'll be interesting. Will there be more liberal and Democratic voices as part of the conversation? I'm guessing there will be, but we will see. The second thing is, don't underestimate the power of the subpoena. The ability of the House of Representatives to perform an oversight role, which is necessary for checks and balances, is also an incredible engine, like boiler room when it comes to journalism, because they're going to be able to obtain all kinds of records reporters couldn't wheedle out of loyalists to Trump, whether in his private life or in the administration. And they're going to obtain a hell of a lot of stuff. And some of that is going to find its way into the press and become public knowledge. And then each of those things is going to create its own orbit of stories. And so you're going to see conflict, some of them substantive, all of them having political ramifications. You know, Washington will be consumed with how does this affect 2020? Everything is that way. But also the actual substance of what's being discussed will be very interesting. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot more oversight of the Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross. A lot of questions circling him. The Interior Secretary, who's just been referred for possible criminal investigation by the Justice Department by the woman who's his current acting Inspector General. There's a series of, you've already lost the guy at EPA, you already lost the guy at HHS. Ben Carson, in normal circumstances, what Carson did would be a real problem, but he's like, 7th on the depth chart here, So I think you're going to see a lot of different kinds of coverage than you've seen because there are going to be different pressure points and levers for journalists to press. They are at once independent operators and also part of a larger kind of ecosystem on how Washington works and how information gets to the public. They have to exercise independent, ethical, journalistic decisions on what they do. But it's I think it's going to be even more of a free-for-all in some ways because there's going to be greater sources of information.
Do we have one more? We've got two. Oh, wow, you guys are just coming out of the woodwork now. Okay, I don't know where the mic, Isaac, you got the mic. How about we go right there, and then we'll go up to the top.
Hi, I'm Alexandra Tempest, Associate Editor at the Progressive magazine. So as you can tell by the name of my publication, we take a very, forward approach with, identifying where we're coming from politically. So when we talk about bias and we talk about journalism and seeking the truth, not just reporting, well, this is what one side says, this is what the other side says, but actually pointing out what the truth is. Do you think it's possible that actually being open with, here's our values, here's what we think is right, can be helpful in the pursuit of truth? Because I've found that in working at various left publications that by being clear about what we believe to be good and right, it helps us pursue the truth more fully. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
I certainly think that I think having an ideological vantage point is something probably very difficult to separate from the act of journalism. So being very clear about the position you're taking and articulating that, I think, is helpful. And I think I'd even take it a step further, that we keep talking about journalism as if it's, okay, our job is to just reflect what's happening out there. Well, there's lots of different approaches to journalism, right? I mean, one of them is one that takes a stronger normative position, thinks about society as having certain goals you're trying to attain. And this is traditions like civic journalism and community journalism, where you take a very strong position to say that there are goals that we as a society should try to attain, and then you do journalism that focuses on those concerns. So to me, that's a style of doing journalism that I would welcome more of. I think instead what's happened with a lot of DC reporting and beyond has been stenographers to power. If they say it, it's reported and it's repeated, and that just gives them that amplifying engine. So I really appreciate what you're doing. I think it's fantastic.
Can I just say as well that, the real question is, can news organizations do both? Can they inform you what powerful people are saying, and can they also set their own news agendas? What stories are worth digging in on? What do we need to learn about? What articulated aims are not being achieved, and what unarticulated aims are important for society, and where do they go? And I got to say, most news organizations started subtly shifting from an idea of objectivity to an idea of fairness, starting about 15 years ago. And this idea of objectivity lived on after, call it World War II, or maybe during World War II, and the idea was in some ways driven by economics. And that was, they wanted to, newspapers wanted to appeal to the broadest number of readers possible. When there were 9 to 15 different newspapers in every city, they would take, like cable channels, a smaller segment of the market. And that's why you have newspapers with the word Democrat or Republican in their names. And that was branding, very consciously. They had ties for a reason. Sometimes they were underwritten by those interests. Sometimes they were just going after the audience. But you started to see that period after World War II ended up being the exception rather than the rule. There was segmentation. Places like the Washington Post haven't abandoned the idea of being nonpartisan, but they've abandoned the idea of, well, we're objective and aloof. And they say, okay, we want to be fair. And we think about this a lot at NPR. We think about empathy a lot at NPR, but we think, are we going to be fair to the people we are covering? Are we going to be fair to the stories we're covering? Are we going to be fair to the audience we're serving? And particularly, are we going to be fair to the facts and the truth? That is the overriding, to my mind, sort of guiding principles of where we go. And the idea that bias is directing us, and the idea that bias, or fears about being accused of bias, is inhibiting us, isn't reflective of life as it's lived within the news organizations. At NPR, we do have political reporters who sometimes have to report what's happening in front of them, but that is not what editors are talking about. They're like, what's happening? What's the dynamics driving this? Who are the actors? And what are the dramas happening that nobody's even thinking about? And you see reporters trying very hard at times to get at that stuff. That's when news organizations are fulfilling their jobs. If you looked at what the Times did with that investigation of Trump's finances that appeared a few weeks ago, they used the word fraud to talk about what the president did before he reached the White House. They didn't say, it is possible that they're under a certain legal light. There is a world in which one could say, no. They said, he committed what appears to be fraud. Pretty strong words. But they were very transparent. That's a journalistic value that we can embrace and advocate very strongly without being partisan, without holding a brief. We're in favor of accountability, we're in favor of transparency, and that's true for anyone we cover, right? Anybody in a position of power. They were transparent about how they reached those conclusions because they put every single one of those documents as part of their online sample. You could hover your cursor and pop up the document. They reprinted it in a special section that included, photo images of all of those documents. Well, that gives you trust and faith that what they're presenting is checkable and true. That's a good way to go. So I think are having a needed conversation with the public about ethics and bias, but in reality, internally, we're having a debate about fairness and about context. And it's like we're having these two different conversations at the same time, if that helps.
Yeah, I do think, as David sort of alluded to, I mean, newspapers really started out as partisan vehicles. It was really only when the advertising industry became a thing that objectivity mattered, because you could sell ads based on not, adhering to a partisan affiliation. All of that being said, I think whatever your values are, whether they are partisan or ideological or to just certain principles, the more transparent and upfront you are about them, the better. And as long as that's what's shaping the way you make decisions about what you're covering, the things that you're highlighting and elevating, and as long as that's not coloring the facts that you're presenting, as long as that's not, causing you to withhold things that are true and without, or causing you to skew things in a certain way that is inaccurate, then I think if you're being upfront, that's a good thing. There's room, I think, like Devon said, there's room for a lot of different kinds of journalism and a lot of different styles and approaches. And the more upfront we are about how we do our jobs, I think maybe the more we can restore some trust in what we're doing.
So Isaac, I think there was one up there.
So earlier you guys mentioned the bias, how there's this perceived bias that everyone within the newsroom, the journalists, are all liberal. And so do you think that this is driving young people who have conservative leanings away from choosing a career in journalism? And will this kind of change the landscape of journalism in the coming decades?
So, I think there's pretty good evidence that journalists, by and large, do tend to politically lean left. But the evidence in terms of the reporting is that, as people have already mentioned, that you look at especially presidential or political reporting, especially from legacy media or from major news outlets, tends to be very balanced. So I would hope that wouldn't discourage conservative journalists or journalism students from wanting to pursue that as a career. Because I think, while I think a lot of journalists have an ideological perspective when they do the practice of journalism, I think what we've heard repeatedly is they really try to engage in various techniques to avoid having that strong partisan viewpoint shape the kind of reporting they're doing, and certainly the kind of facts they're sharing. So I would hope that's not the case, but I suspect that there is perceptions about, which kind of occupation is welcoming to people of different political orientations. And we know that there's occupational sorting based on ideology. So I think it's somewhat probably unavoidable, though, when we teach journalism in our department, I think we teach it straight down the middle. I don't think we're trying to teach it in a way that serves a particular ideological interest.
You see CNN has hired a reporter from the National Review, and she does straight-ahead reporting. Bob Costa, who's an excellent political reporter for the Washington Post and just took over Washington Week in Review. He came from the National Review. He really spoke the language of House Republicans and understood them and burrowed in and then reported on them fairly. And he showed that that's what he was interested in doing. And a lot of it is sort of who's up, who's down, but it gives you real insight into how policy was made and the substantive results of these power politics in ways that I think were invaluable. At NPR, I would say that although I don't think that the military is uniform, it is seen as more conservative than perhaps the overall population. We have a number of veterans who have come and worked for us and report for us and produce for us. And, we're not looking for ideological diversity per se, but we're looking for people from all walks of life and all experience to work for us. And one of the other nice things about NPR is we post every single job online. So I got this conservative reviewer started haranguing me online and doing things, and I started sending him job applications. Said, "Look, he's like, an NPR would never hire me." I'm like, "Well, you should start to apply. Like, send pitches, for the love of God." When I was a student editor in the late '80s, early '90s, we were dealing with these issues as well. Students from the Cornell Review, which is sort of like inspired by the Dartmouth Review and the National Review, would accuse us of bias, and I would talk to conservatives on campus, and I think, as I remember, it's been quite a while, but talking to a couple of conservative groups and say, you guys should come and go through our process and be reporters and see what it's like, and you guys can help inform the culture of the place. It's an open place. You have to go through a process. You have to do training. You have to show that you have mastered certain journalistic techniques, but you can propose different stories, and if it works, let's do it. Like, it seemed to me like, great, let's go. So I don't think it's on us to say we have no interest in, if people happen to come into our newsroom, then conservatives will work there. I think we have to be thoughtful about how we incorporate different outlooks and different backgrounds and different folks from different walks. But I also think that, people have to embrace the leading concepts of it. There's this interesting thing going on where there's been Facebook has authenticated or verified various journalistic outfits as fact checkers who can officially participate in it. The Weekly Standard, a conservative magazine that I read a lot, was authenticated. And so they are now engaging in fact-checking enterprises, much like the folks who give out the Pinocchios of the Washington Post or factcheck.org or PolitiFact do. And they can help validate whether stories are valid or not. Now, this is an interesting tension because it's not like the Weekly Standard's on the right and the Washington Post is on the left. The Washington Post doesn't see itself that way. And the Weekly Standard may approach its fact-checking with a different way, and there's some controversy about it. But it'll be interesting to see. Maybe they will embrace this, and this will help inform how they, the rigor they apply to some of the claims they make, even as they advance a certain ideological outlook. I think that's actually kind of promising. I'm interested to see how it plays out. But, I feel like let 1,000 flowers bloom as long as people are willing to be intellectually honest. And as I said before, admit fact against interest, and then I think it's all cool.
All right, we are at the bewitching hour, but I know we had one more question. This gentleman right here. I know we had more than one question, but we're going to go with one final question. Oh, he's yielding the floor.
So I'm gonna take the bait on the should we cover Donald Trump or not question.
Thank God, at last an editor's willing to make a judgment on this.
I agree with Devon that Donald Trump is the distractor in chief, and while we in the media are all busily covering his bread and circuses, he's got all these agencies being dismantled in the background that nobody is covering. But I also think that, as Jesse, you said, that he's the president and we have to cover what he's saying. Twitter for Donald Trump is what the fireside chat was for Franklin Roosevelt. And nobody would say, should you cover Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chat? I think that, David, your point about Trump being looked at around the world is crucially important, because the Nigeria story you mentioned, what happened was Trump spoke and said that they should shoot live bullets at the caravan. The Nigerian military had just shot live bullets at protesters. They put that video up on their official Twitter site, and they said, take a look and decide for yourself, was the quote on their Twitter page. So leaders around the world, Duterte in the Philippines, Erdogan in Turkey, and so on, are using Trump's pronouncements against the media. We need to cover Trump, but we need to deconstruct what he's saying and really look at that and expose that to people. So when he says we're sending 15,000 troops down to the border to protect against the marauding caravans, we need to point out that's 5 U.S. soldiers for every single refugee, man, woman, and child that's walking 900 miles from Guatemala to Harlingen, Texas.
I think there's a lot of truth embedded in there. I'm not going to argue with you.
Well, that's the final word, I guess.
My proposal will be that we'll do a minute-long spot, and I'll probably have a conversation on Here and Now tomorrow, which is one of our midday shows, On Point done in collaboration with WBUR in Boston, in which I incorporate that into a larger conversation about his aggressive rhetoric, his pivot to attack the press anew as a way of distracting from what is the hard truth of what's happened in the House of Representatives.
And perhaps to compare Trump's attacks on the media to what other authoritarian leaders are doing around the world today and what other authoritarian leaders have done historically, for instance, Mussolini and Hitler.
Well, I don't think we have to go to that.
Well, we're not going to a Hitler comparison, that's for sure.
I don't think we have to go to that because he hasn't acted in that way, and if he were, I would, but he hasn't, so I shan't. But I have compared his rhetoric to what you have seen around the country a number of times in Duterte and Erdogan and Putin, because he clearly finds a rhetorical affinity for what these figures we once would have called strongmen, hold out to the public. And that in and of itself is disturbing for a guy whose State Department usually is the leader in the world in objecting to such behavior abroad.
Well, with that, I would like to thank our panelists. I would like to thank all of you for being here for this important conversation. And I just want to say that I am exceptionally proud to be associated with an enterprise that is willing to take hard looks at itself, at its practices. You know, you didn't see a bunch of defensiveness up here. I was interviewing a physician one time who asked what my area of study was, and I said journalism ethics, and he said, "Is that really a thing?" I said, "Why, yes it is. And when was the last time you hosted some public panel in which the public could challenge you on your practices and standards?" So I am really grateful. I am really grateful to tell the story of journalism, which is not flawless, but is overall, in my mind, an incredibly important and positive story to tell. So with that, thank you again to everyone for being here tonight.
Try to tell myself you gotta take it slow.